مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. الانتخابات الرئاسية لا تتعلق فقط بالشخصيات. سيختار الأمريكيون اختيارا مهما يتعلق باتجاه البلد فيما يخص كل من القضايا الداخلية والسياسة الخارجية. في واقع الأمر القرارات التي يتخذها الناخبون الأمريكيون بشأن السياسة الخارجية لها تأثيرات مهمة على الناس حول العالم. هل يجدر بنا التدخل في مشاكل العالم أم التركيز على علاج المشاكل داخل بلدنا؟ هل نحن الشرطي يحرص على تنفيذ القواعد العالمية أم رجل متافه يسارع لحل الأزمات؟ هل نحن ممرضة تساعد في الكوارث الإنسانية أم مصرفي يدفع ثمن كل هذا؟ ما هو أهم خطر نواجهه؟ الدول الشريرة والجماعات الإرهابية أم فوضى الدول المنحرة؟ هل المستقبل مشرق أم مظلم؟ لمناقشة اتجاه الجدل الدائر حول السياسة الخارجية في انتخاباتنا الرئاسية، يسرني أن أرحب بخبير تمتد خبرته فيما بين عالمي السياسة والمنح الأكاديمية، وهو الأستاذ بروس جنتلسون، مستشار وزارة الخارجية السابق. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Foreign policy plays a big role in our presidential election campaign. So today I'm delighted to welcome Professor Bruce Jentleson, an old friend, to talk about the nature of the foreign policy debate in the presidential election. Bruce, thanks for joining us.
Good to be with you, Rob.
So let's take a look at how foreign policy is playing a role so far in the early months of our presidential election campaign. How do you view the debate so far, the big issues, the fissures between the parties and even within the parties?
So it's interesting, if we go back to, say, the 1970s and 80s, it was the Democratic Party that had major splits in foreign policy within it. The Republicans were pretty consolidated. It's very much the reverse now. There's differences between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, but they're not nearly of the magnitude and depth of what we're seeing in the Republican Party. So what we see in the Republican Party is everything from Rand Paul, sort of an isolationist, America should do as little as possible in the world, and for all sorts of reasons, budget, economics, not our business, etc. And then to say at the other extreme, I think you have still sort of what in the George W. Bush years was the neoconservative position, you know, which Jeb Bush is leaning a bit to. And it's more of a, we have both our interests and our values, we have to be active in the world, we need to use force a lot. Senator Lindsey Graham has been taking this position, although he's less than 1% in the polls. And then sort of in the middle, you're having different versions. You have sort of the Donald Trump, let's just bash everybody in sight, you know, we're America, we're great, let's build a wall against the Mexicans, I'll go tell Putin, I'll just go see Putin, I'll tell him what to do, and he'll say yes sir, no sir, kind of like on The Apprentice. So you have at least 3 or 4 positions within Republicans. We'll start to see the differences between the two parties in 2016 as the election season really moves on towards the general election.
When candidates talk about the need for nation building at home, I mean, nobody likes to be an isolationist, so they phrase it somewhat differently. What does that mean, and is that an option in today's world?
It really isn't, and it's interesting, the public opinion polls, some people misinterpret it. When people are asked about, do you want to make major commitments, send troops, and they say no in higher percentages than they did, say, 15 years ago, sometimes that gets interpreted as isolationism. It's not isolationism. It's a prudence and a pragmatism coming out of the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War. But I actually think the public, and when you dig down in the polls, you see that they understand, and we're talking about people not just inside the Washington Beltway, not just on college campuses, but the average American, including in rural areas, they understand you can't run away from the world. can't run away from terrorism. You can't run away from the fact that our economy depends heavily on currency fluctuations and trade. So they get that. There's a lot of anxiety out there, and there's a lot of wariness, people still wanting to know what is being proposed. So the average public really gets that, and I think that it's really more about different brands of internationalism, if you will. When Democrats talk about nation building at home, so recently I debated someone who wrote a book called The Obama Doctrine, and his thesis was Obama really wanted to be a domestic president. And I said, well, not really. Even if you look at his first term and you look at all of the ventures he had, it may have been his preference, but he quickly found out you can't do that. He had the war in Afghanistan. You know, he had the START deal, the arms control deal with the Russians when things were still going well. He had the Arab Spring and everything that's happened after that. So I don't think it's an either or. You know, I think it's a degree of emphasis sometimes for campaigns. When you're appealing to crowds, you know, you want them to know you're going to take care of things at home. But on January 20, 2017, I don't think whoever's president, they'll believe that you can do domestic policy and not foreign policy.
Well, whoever is president will inherit at least two ongoing military operations, the Syria Iraq theater and Afghanistan, which will continue to be going on. Is this equally a burden for a Republican and a presidential victor in our next year's election?
You know, I think it is. There's a lot of interesting work about, not just in our country, but in other countries where a new leader comes in and they can make major transitions in their foreign policy, whether it's a democratic system or an authoritarian system. So it's really more the new leader. I think there'll be an effort to shift policies. I mean, it won't, for example, I think the issue in Afghanistan, from my perspective, is not just how many troops you have, but how do you do the regional diplomacy there? There are so many players there, and no matter how many troops we have for how long, ultimately we're going to have some rules of the road that involve everybody from India and Pakistan and Saudi Arabia and the Chinese and the Russians and some of the Central Asians. And so if somebody can shift to a more what I would consider complete and creative policy, it could be an opportunity for them. The Iraq-Syria theater, you know, who knows, right? I mean, we have a relatively small commitment there. It's totally inadequate. And, you know, it's teaching us yet again from the Middle East that if you don't do the Middle East, it does you. Right?
Well, there's a fascinating confluence. If one just watches the recent presidential debates, the Republicans may pillory Hillary, but there's a huge overlap on what they're suggesting to do vis-a-vis Syria, where Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio and Hillary Clinton all say almost exactly the same thing. Create no-fly zones, protect the civilians in the country if you can, which would require more engagement of American force.
Right. I mean, it goes back to after the 2012 election, you know, various reports that we've both seen and some of our viewers have seen, that there were proposals made that were backed by then Secretary of State Clinton, CIA Director David Petraeus, you know, to start to ramp up our engagement in Syria for, you know, a no-fly zone, you know, combined with a different approach to the diplomacy. So she kind of has a track record there. I think the difference in the two parties is when you hear it from, say, Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio, it's dressed up in this rhetoric about, you know, if America would only use its force, then the world would be okay, right? I think it's very dangerous rhetoric, right? You know, I think one of the most disturbing things I've seen recently in the coalition is the shifting of some of our coalition partners in terms of the use of their air power, you know, away from that theater to Yemen, right? It points out how we have allies, but we have some interests we share and some that are different. And I think from Secretary Clinton, you know, you hear a bit more of the combination of force and diplomacy. It's about American leadership, but it's American leadership, not just this notion that if we use force, everything will be okay. That's more the Republican mantra.
I earlier asked you about the phrase one hears on the stump. You know, let's nation build at home. Another phrase one often hears is, "We can't be the world's policeman." Is this a straw man? Were we ever the world's policeman? What does that mean in practice? And should we be the world's policeman?
Good question, because in the Cold War there's this notion we look back, sometimes with rose-colored glasses, you know, seeing only the things we want to see, as if everything we did in the Cold War worked. The reality, I think, at least in my view as a scholar and, have been involved in some policy, is that our policy, against the Soviet Union directly in Eastern Europe worked extremely well. But in what we used to call the third world, we had lots of disasters and lots of situations where we didn't live up to our so-called values, right? Where we supported dictators with the rationalization saying every other option was going to be pro-Soviet. We did it in the Middle East, we did it in Latin America, we did it in Asia, we did it in Africa. And so the notion of somehow it all worked then and we were policing the world, we put some thugs in power in lots of places.
They were our thugs.
They were our, right, the expression, which you probably can't say, but they were our thugs, and we looked the other way. Two things. One, that didn't work very well. Many of the problems we have today are the outgrowth of that. And secondly, it's a lot harder to do today. That's where things like the internet and social media really kick in. The ability to keep things quiet, relatively quiet, is much less in this 21st century era for a whole variety of reasons. So I don't think it's about us policing the world. I think it's very much a role of leadership, but also one in which we also sometimes need to say to our allies, to me, ISIS is an existential threat to many countries in the region. It's a serious threat to us. And the notion that we should somehow go in there and do it for our allies, A, I don't think that's right for us, and B, I don't think it would work. We have to do it with them. And that's not leading from behind, it's not leading on your own. I don't know, it's sort of leading for results, and it's going to take different configurations in the Middle East, in Asia. But I think we really need to get away from somehow the notion that the world spins around us, because I just don't think it's an accurate sense of the way the world is.
Okay, when we come back with Professor Bruce Jentleson, we're going to talk about what is the most serious type of threat we face. Is it evil, or is it chaos, or a combination of the two? In just a moment. Bruce Jentleson is Professor of Public Policy and Political Science at Duke University, my alma mater, where he previously served as director of the Terry Sanford Institute of Public Policy, now the Sanford School. On the policy front, he served in the Obama administration as senior advisor to the State Department's policy planning director, and in the Clinton administration as a member of the State Department's policy planning staff. Many moons ago, he was a foreign policy aide to the then Senator Al Gore. Professor Jentleson received his undergraduate degree from Cornell University, a master's from the London School of Economics, and a doctorate also from Cornell. All right, let's go back to chaos versus evil, evil versus chaos. What should we fear more?
I think chaos, because chaos creates opportunities for evil, right? So there's this commercial which people may have seen on American TV about Las Vegas, and it says, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. It's probably not true in real life, but what we're seeing in the 21st century is what happens inside states does not stay inside states. I think of this as the Vegas dilemma for global affairs, right? Why did ISIS grow? I actually think it's less about Iraq than Syria, because it had land it could go to, it had chaos and anarchy in Syria. Why was Putin able to annex Crimea and send the little green men into Ukraine? Because Ukraine had internal instability. And so the whole question of state building, which has had solutions in the past which weren't really solutions. One was send the American military in and we'll do it. Iraq didn't work. Another was, sort of the people with their PowerPoints and their briefcases and come in and say, this is how you build a state. You have an election, that also hasn't worked. But ultimately, I think that's the crucial issue in the Middle East and elsewhere. And unless people feel that the arrow starts to point in the right direction, that their children have better opportunities than they do, even if it doesn't solve all the problems ahead, we're going to continue to have the kind of chaos inside states that makes opportunities. And if ISIS were to be destroyed tomorrow, I think we both know there'd be another ISIS. And not just of an Islamist type, but in other parts of the world. So for me, it's really this question, of how do you try to create sufficient stability inside countries that you can reduce the opportunities for all sorts of terrorists and others who come in trying to do bad things to people there and to others outside the country.
Compelling argument. I think there's a good case for evil too,
Yeah.
and it's worthy of a great debate.
Good.
Let me ask you about the person for whom your new fellowship is named, because he is so connected to the idea of strong states in the international system, and that's Henry Kissinger. You have the Kissinger Chair. Why is Henry Kissinger still so relevant today at 91 or whatever his age is, and the concept of states and dealing with states in the international arena?
He's actually 92 now,
92.
and amazingly, in fact, one of the opportunities I have is a few weeks from now to actually go up and sit down with him and talk to him both about the book I'm writing with his chair and other things in the world. He had a sense of the importance of states. I think that sometimes people, miss other elements of Kissinger's strategy. Let me give you two examples. So one of the really interesting things was the opening to China that he and Zhou Enlai negotiated in secret in 1971. And you can actually read now the transcripts from that. They're declassified, very little redacted, very little taken out. Fascinating discussions, not just talking points. Got to what's your theory of history? Here's mine. Had some aides. Had some humor back and forth, like they both knew that their bureaucracies hated them and they traded jokes about that. But that's the kind of statecraft I think that Kissinger practiced. We look back on that and we say, well, of course, but if you look at the conditions at the time, including the domestic politics in the US, the China lobby, and cultural revolution in China, it took a lot of real quality diplomacy, statesmanship, statecraft. The other point I'd make about Kissinger was, we were talking about Afghanistan earlier. When the Obama administration came in 2009, it had this major policy review, and it looked at three options. And I was in the administration then, I was not a part of this, but my concern then and now was all the options were defined in terms of troop levels. Kissinger at the troop levels. Kissinger at the time was arguing, and some of us were too, that it was about regional diplomacy as well. That until you said to the countries in the region, we're not going to fix this for you, and we can't fix this if you guys still are causing problems there. We need some, what I called before, rules of the road. We needed a regional dialogue, that would go and that would establish things. At the same time, the U.S. would decide on whatever troop levels it was keeping. I think that has a lot of implications for many of the issues we face today, right? I think that the question of, the China opening, and as we think about relations with Iran, is a very interesting question. We know the downside risks of being too soft and not taking seriously, Iranian aggression. But it's a really interesting question historically. Sometimes you may there's risks in missing an opportunity for an opening. And I'm not ready to the point to say there is one, but I don't think that should be dismissed. And I think that, Kissinger himself in his latest book said Iran has to decide between being a major regional power and a revolutionary ideological state. And I don't think they've made that decision yet. But I think he even said that there's a decision there. It's not a given that they would be the ideological. So states are really important, but he also subscribed to the notion that we have interests, not permanent enemies, and not even permanent friends.
So let me draw the connection between you and Kissinger. You are both academics who went into the policy world. You're both scholars who bring ideas into their public service. How does that work today in the 21st century? Are these two complementary worlds, or are they worlds that collide, the world of the university and the world of government?
It's a really great question. And on the university side, the gap, there's responsibility on both sides. The university world, the world of political science and others has gone, way in the direction of theory for theory, way too much, in my view. And sometimes in the policy world, it's, I know I should read, but I have no time to read. Well, that's probably why you don't have time to read. I actually think that the era we're living in, and this will sort of come through in our presidential debate, is a transitional era globally. And it's one in which we really need to think about what the big questions are as well as what the immediate news cycle tactical questions. To me, it's a lot like, you know, the era after World War II when the Cold War was taking shape and concepts like deterrence and containment were developed. I really think we're in that kind of era where we need ideas that can be operational. They're not just at 37,000 feet, but they're also not just the sum total of the latest news cycle. And cross-fertilization, in my experience, when you build a personal relationship with people in the policy world and they say things like, oh, you're okay, you're not a typical academic, it actually works for you, you play against type, but then we work together as a team and we each bring different kinds of knowledge to the table. And that kind of integration, I think, is really crucial. For a lot of the Cold War, we sort of knew what the questions were and we debated the answers. You know, chaos, evil, many other things. I think we're really debating what the questions are.
Very good. Professor Bruce Jennelson, thank you very much for being with us in Dakhel, Washington.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Good.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول الزعامة الأميركية في الشرق الأوسط، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhurra.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.